Picture a woman's pelvis so severely deformed by malnutrition that the birth canal measures barely 3 inches across. Now imagine a full-term baby's head trying to pass through that impossible space. The screaming lasted for days before both mother and child died in agony. Their bones still locked together when archaeologists found them 8 centuries later. This isn't speculation, it's forensic evidence from recently excavated medieval sites across Europe. What shocks researchers isn't just the scale of skeletal trauma they're discovering, but the systematic way these deaths were hidden from historical records. Church documents, legal proceedings, medical texts, and they all conspire to conceal a death toll so staggering that if it happened today, we'd call it genocide. The Italian coffin birth case reveals post-mortem fetal extrusion with tool marks on the mother's skull, showing desperate attempts at medieval brain surgery. But that's just the beginning of archaeological evidence that proves medieval childbirth was a death sentence deliberately engineered by those in power. Subscribe to discover what other forensic horrors are emerging from medieval graveyards, and why modern historians are just now admitting they got everything wrong. But before we dive deeper into these bone-chilling discoveries, there's one particular piece of evidence that changes everything we thought we knew about medieval childbirth. A stained piece of parchment that spent 5 centuries hiding its secrets until Dr. Sarah Fiddyment decided to look closer. The artifact sits in London's Wellcome collection. Measuring just 4 inches wide but stretching nearly 10 feet long, its surface covered in faded Latin prayers and mysterious dark stains that previous researchers had dismissed as simple age spots or water damage. When Fiddyment placed her laboratory samples under proteomic analysis in 2021, she expected to find traces of animal skin and medieval ink, nothing more than standard parchment composition. Instead, what she discovered embedded deep within those stains made her question everything historians had assumed about these so-called birthing girdles. The proteins weren't from animals or writing materials, they were human cervico-vaginal fluids, along with traces of honey, milk, and herbs that medieval medical texts describe as emergency childbirth treatments. This wasn't just a religious relic that women prayed over. This was physical evidence of a woman's final moments. Her bodily fluids and desperate tears literally absorbed into the parchment she believed would save her life. The prayers had been worn away by countless desperate fingers. The Latin text rubbed smooth by women who clutched this girdle while experiencing pain we can barely comprehend. But here's what will haunt you. This single artifact represents just one death among millions that medieval authorities spent centuries trying to erase from history, and what we're about to uncover will forever change how you see the past. That single stained parchment in London represents far more than one woman's tragic death. It's a window into a statistical nightmare that will fundamentally alter how you understand medieval society. Let me give you numbers that will make your skin crawl. Because when you truly grasp the scale of what happened to women in the Middle Ages, you'll realize we're not talking about unfortunate medical limitations. We're talking about systematic slaughter. In modern Britain, 13 women die for every 100,000 births. A tragedy that makes headlines and triggers investigations when it happens. That's a mortality rate of 0.013%. So rare that most people will never personally know someone who died in childbirth. Now brace yourself for the medieval reality that Cambridge University researchers have spent decades documenting through archaeological evidence and newly discovered records. 1 in 18 married women died giving birth. Not 1 in 1800. Not 1 in 800, 1 in 18. That means if you gathered 18 medieval wives in a room, statistically one of them wouldn't survive her pregnancies. But it gets exponentially worse when you understand the cumulative horror these women faced. Medieval women didn't have just 1 or 2 children. They had 6, 7, sometimes 10 or more pregnancies throughout their fertile years, and every single labor was a roll of the dice with death. The individual birth risk ranged from 1.2 to 1.7%, depending on social class and location, meaning every time a medieval woman went into labor, she faced odds roughly equivalent to playing Russian roulette with a 100-chamber revolver. Now multiply that risk across multiple pregnancies over 15 to 20 years of childbearing, and the lifetime statistics become absolutely staggering. More than 1 in 3 women died during their childbearing years. Not from disease, not from accidents, not from violence, but specifically from the biological process that our society celebrates today as the miracle of birth. To put this in perspective that will horrify you, medieval childbirth was 130 times more dangerous than it is today. 130 times. That's not a gradual improvement over centuries. That's the difference between a death sentence and a routine medical procedure. Archaeological surveys across Europe consistently reveal cemetery populations where young adult female remains vastly outnumber male, remains in the same age groups, a demographic impossibility unless something was systematically killing women during their prime reproductive years. The Cambridge study of 102 aristocratic English women from 1,236 to 1,503, the absolute elite who had access to the best food, housing, and medical care available, still shows maternal mortality rates that would trigger international humanitarian intervention if they occurred anywhere in the world today. But these numbers only tell part of the story, because what we're about to uncover reveals that the true horror wasn't just biological. It was the result of deliberate social and religious choices that turned natural childbirth challenges into a medieval massacre. And the evidence of how this systematic killing machine operated will make those statistics feel like gentle preparation for the nightmare we're about to explore. Those horrifying statistics become even more chilling when you understand the medieval world that created this systematic death machine. Because these weren't random tragedies. They were the inevitable result of a society that deliberately constructed every aspect of women's lives to maximize their reproductive vulnerability while providing absolutely no medical protection. Picture a typical medieval girl celebrating what she thinks is her childhood. Maybe she's 12, still playing with carved wooden dolls, when her father announces her betrothal to a man twice her age she's never met. By 14 or 15, she's married and immediately expected to become pregnant. Her child's body still developing as she's forced into the adult responsibility of creating the next generation. Her daily reality involves chronic malnutrition that we can literally see etched into her bones centuries later. Archaeologists have documented severe vitamin D deficiencies that warped pelvic bones into impossible shapes, narrowing birth canals to deadly dimensions, while her body simultaneously tries to support the massive caloric demands of repeated pregnancies. She might spend 15 to 20 years of her life either pregnant or recovering from childbirth, with medical care that consisted of prayers, herb mixtures, and interventions that would be considered torture by modern standards. Medieval society had absolutely no understanding of infection, no concept of sterile procedures, no knowledge of anatomy beyond what could be observed externally, and no comprehension that bacteria even existed. When complications arose during labor, the response wasn't medical treatment, parchment. It was desperate religious ritual combined with physical interventions that often killed faster than the original problem. But here's what makes this systematic slaughter even more disturbing. Medieval society not only expected these women to die, they built entire social and legal frameworks around that expectation. Women routinely wrote their wills before going into labor, not as paranoid precaution, but because everyone from their families to their priests assumed they probably wouldn't survive. The church taught that childbirth pain was divine punishment for Eve's original sin, meaning women who screamed during labor were displaying weakness in their faith, while those who requested any form of pain relief were literally accused of witchcraft. The first recorded woman burned at the stake for requesting pain medication during childbirth. This wasn't ignorance born from lack of alternatives. This was willful religious doctrine that prioritized theological concepts over human life. Young wives learned to prepare for death with each pregnancy, while simultaneously being pressured to continue reproducing until their bodies literally couldn't survive another attempt. They lived in a world where the birthing chamber represented a more reliable death sentence than any medieval battlefield. And what these women faced in those chambers, the desperate measures they tried, the unimaginable interventions inflicted upon them, the systematic cruelty disguised as medical care, will reveal a horror so profound that you'll understand why medieval authorities worked so hard to hide these stories from history. This systematic torture of medieval women raises an obvious question. If childbirth really claimed 1 in 18 wives and killed more than a third of all women during their reproductive years, why aren't medieval history books filled with accounts of this demographic catastrophe? Why did it take 21st century forensic science to reveal the true scope of what happened to these women? The answer will make you question everything you've been taught about medieval record-keeping. Because what we're dealing with isn't historical oversight. It's deliberate, systematic suppression of evidence that spans 8 centuries and involves every level of medieval authority. Official church records, the primary historical documents we rely on for understanding medieval life, consistently underreport maternal deaths by staggering margins that archaeologists now describe as, very probably, contrary to lived reality. When researchers compare written documentation with actual skeletal evidence from medieval cemeteries, they discover cemetery populations where young adult female remains outnumber historical death records by ratios that should be statistically impossible. Medieval scribes, almost exclusively male clergy members who never witnessed childbirth and had vested theological interests in minimizing evidence of divine punishment's effectiveness, systematically classified maternal deaths as fever, weakness, or simply natural causes without specifying the actual circumstances. Secular legal documents show similar patterns of deliberate obscuration, with property inheritance records that mention a woman's death but carefully avoid detailing whether she died in childbed, despite the legal implications for inheritance rights and remarriage prospects. Even more damning is the archaeological evidence from medieval burial sites that reveals burial patterns completely contradicting official records: mass graves of young women buried with fetal remains, cemetery sections dedicated specifically to maternal deaths, and bone evidence of repeated childbirth trauma that never appears in any contemporary written account. Church authorities had powerful motivations for hiding the true scale of maternal mortality because widespread knowledge of these death rates would have challenged core religious doctrines about divine providence and the blessed nature of marriage and reproduction. If congregations fully understood that marriage was essentially a death sentence for their daughters, the entire medieval social structure built around early marriage and continuous reproduction would have collapsed. Secular authorities collaborated in this suppression because acknowledging the true demographic impact would have exposed the unsustainable nature of medieval population policies and the deliberate sacrifice of women for economic and political expansion. For centuries, the full horror was hidden through a combination of selective record-keeping, theological rationalization, and the simple fact that the women who could have testified to their own experiences were dead. Until now, modern archaeological techniques, from biomolecular analysis to advanced bone scanning technology, have given voice to 800 years of silenced suffering, and what you're about to see will explain exactly why medieval authorities worked so desperately to bury these stories. Because the evidence reveals not just medical ignorance, but calculated decisions that prioritized social control over human life, turning natural biological challenges into systematic slaughter that makes medieval warfare look merciful by comparison. Now that you understand why medieval authorities worked so hard to suppress evidence of maternal mortality, you need to see what drove desperate women to attempt remedies so horrific that modern medical professionals struggle to read the documented accounts without physical revulsion. These weren't quaint folk remedies or harmless superstitions. They were the dying gasps of women who understood exactly how trapped they were and would try literally anything to avoid the agonizing death that statistics promised was coming. The most widely documented practice involved wrapping snake skins around laboring women's abdomens, a procedure described in chilling detail by the 12th century medical text known as the Trocula, which states that if a woman was having difficulty with a child coming out, let the woman be girded with a snake's skin from which the snake has emerged. Imagine the texture of dried reptilian scales pressed against swollen, contracting flesh, the putrid smell of decomposing animal matter mixing with the metallic scent of blood and amniotic fluid, while women convinced themselves that this revolting ritual might somehow prevent their imminent death. But snakeskins were just the beginning of a catalog of desperate measures that reveals the absolute terror these women felt. The 15th century English medical text, The Sickness of Women, recommends that laboring mothers leet girden here with a girdle of unhurted skin, heart's dear skin wrapped tightly around the abrosen torso, while simultaneously instructing them to rub precious stones directly on their thighs during contractions. Archaeological evidence shows that medieval women clutched sard, amber, and jasper stones so desperately during labor that the gems bear permanent indentations from fingernails, the smooth surfaces worn away by hands slick with sweat and blood, gripping these stones like talismans against death while their bodies were literally tearing apart. Even more disturbing were the internal applications that medieval medical texts describe in nauseating detail. Honey mixed with pulverized herbs including garden cress, laurel berries, frankincense, and cinnamon, formed into balls and inserted directly into the vagina, then secured with bands tied around the woman's loins. The Trotula specifically instructs that these honey mixtures should be placed on the loins and tied with a band in a ball, and inserted into the vagina for women experiencing uterine displacement, meaning medieval women endured the agony of foreign objects inserted into their birth canals while simultaneously trying to deliver babies through the same traumatized passage. Religious desperation reached even more heartbreaking extremes, with women borrowing sacred relics like street Anselm's belt so frequently that medieval chroniclers noted it was a common practice for women in the dangers of childbirth to ask for the belt with pious intention. The belt itself shows physical evidence of this desperate use. The leather worn smooth from countless hands, stained with bodily fluids from women who clutched it during their final hours. Perhaps most haunting of all is the evidence from birthing girdles, like the one we examined earlier. Parchment manuscripts containing prayers for safe delivery that show clear signs of being kissed, touched, and clutched so desperately that the text itself has been worn away by the lips and fingers of dying women. These weren't superstitions practiced by ignorant peasants. They were the calculated gambles of women who understood their statistical chances of survival and were willing to endure any additional suffering if it might improve their odds by even a fraction. Because what awaited them in those birthing chambers was a level of medical intervention that makes these desperate folk remedies look merciful by comparison. Those desperate remedies become even more tragic when you understand the brutal biological reality these women faced. Because medieval childbirth wasn't just dangerous due to poor medical care. It was a perfect storm of evolutionary biology colliding with systematic malnutrition that turned every labor into a potentially fatal anatomical impossibility. The human species evolved a devastating reproductive paradox that no other mammal experiences to the same degree. Babies with heads large enough to house complex brains trying to pass through pelvises designed for upright walking, a combination that makes even modern childbirth inherently risky. But medieval women faced this biological challenge with bodies systematically weakened and deformed by chronic nutritional deficiencies that we can measure with disturbing precision in their skeletal remains. The Nubian study of 36 medieval female pelves reveals measurements that will make you understand why so many women died screaming. Birth canals narrowed to barely 3 inches in diameter, pelvic outlets contracted by malnutrition-induced bone deformities that created literal death traps for both mother and child. Vitamin D deficiency, rampant among medieval women who spent their lives indoors and ate diets devoid of essential nutrients, caused a condition called osteomalacia that bent pelvic bones into impossible shapes while simultaneously making them brittle enough to shatter under the pressure of labor contractions. Archaeological analysis shows pelvic bones so severely curved that the birth canal resembles a twisted funnel rather than the smooth passage necessary for delivery, with measurements showing medieval women's pelvic dimensions were significantly smaller than modern populations across multiple anatomical planes. The Milan excavation provides even more horrific evidence. 2 medieval women with pelvic deformities so extreme that their birth canals were physically impossible to navigate, their bones showing scoliosis, severe bending, and narrowed outlets that guaranteed both mother and child would die in agony if pregnancy occurred. But individual skeletal deformities were just the beginning of the biological nightmare. Because medieval women didn't face these challenges once, they endured them repeatedly across 15 to 20 years of continuous reproduction, that progressively weakened already compromised bodies. Each pregnancy leached calcium from bones that were already malformed. Each labor tore tissues that had no time to properly heal. Each delivery stressed cardiovascular systems operating on subsistence nutrition while supporting the massive metabolic demands of growing fetuses. Medieval medicine had absolutely no understanding of infection control, meaning that any tearing during delivery, which was virtually inevitable given the anatomical impossibilities these women faced, became a pathway for bacteria that would cause sepsis, fever, and agonizing death within days of what should have been joyful occasions. They had no knowledge of hemorrhage control beyond crude attempts to pack wounds with whatever materials were available, no surgical techniques for emergency intervention, and no comprehension that cleanliness had any relationship to survival outcomes. And yet, this biological nightmare was made infinitely worse by what medieval society chose to do to these suffering women, because the systematic torture that masqueraded as medical intervention turned survivable complications into guaranteed death sentences. And what you're about to discover will reveal how deliberate cruelty disguised as healing created the most horrific chapters in the story of human suffering. The systematic cruelty of medieval medical intervention becomes undeniably clear when you examine the archaeological evidence that 21st century forensic techniques have finally brought to light, because the bones don't lie, and what they're telling us is almost too horrific to believe. Let's start with the Imola discovery that made international headlines when researchers realized what they were looking at: a woman aged 25 to 35, buried face up in a brick coffin indicating proper burial, but with a 38-week fetus positioned in a way that defied every natural explanation. The fetal skeleton wasn't inside her pelvic cavity where it should have been if she died pregnant. Instead, the head and torso were found between her thighs, while the legs remained trapped within her pelvis, creating an anatomical impossibility that forensic experts initially couldn't explain until they understood they were witnessing postmortem fetal extrusion, a phenomenon where decomposition gases literally force a dead fetus from its mother's body after burial. But the true horror wasn't the coffin birth itself. It was the hole drilled precisely in the center of the woman's skull, showing clear evidence of trepanation performed while she was still alive, complete with 3 parallel horizontal grooves from a circular cutting tool and a small linear cut mark above the hole where someone had peeled back her scalp in preparation for drilling through her skull bone. Medieval physicians had literally attempted brain surgery on a woman dying in childbirth, using crude instruments to bore through living bone in a desperate attempt to relieve what they imagined was pressure causing her labor complications. The Milan excavation reveals even more disturbing evidence of how malnutrition and medieval medical ignorance combined to create systematic torture. 2 women with vitamin D deficiencies so severe that their pelvic bones had bent into impossible configurations, creating birth canals so narrow that delivery was anatomically impossible, while their skeletons show clear evidence of osteomalacia-induced scoliosis, coxavara, and protrusio acetabuli that guaranteed agonizing death for anyone who became pregnant. Archaeological analysis shows these women died with fetuses at 25 to 36 weeks gestation, meaning they endured months of knowing their pregnancies would kill them, while their deformed bones continued deteriorating under the metabolic stress of supporting developing babies. But perhaps the most heartbreaking evidence comes from the Irish medieval burial site, where researchers discovered clear forensic proof of shoulder dystocia, a complication where the baby's shoulders become wedged during delivery, with the fetal scapula literally abutting the posterior aspect of the mother's pubic bone, in a position that proves both mother and child died during the attempted birth. The skeletal positioning shows the baby had progressed far enough through the birth canal that the head had crowned, but the shoulders caught on the narrowed pelvic outlet, trapping both mother and infant in a biological deadlock that medieval medicine had absolutely no techniques to resolve. Each of these cases represents not just individual tragedy, but systematic evidence of how medieval society's deliberate choices, malnutrition through food restriction, early marriage before pelvic development was complete, repeated pregnancies without recovery time, and medical interventions that caused more damage than the original complications, created a demographic catastrophe that makes every war in human history seem merciful by comparison. And what we're about to explore will show you exactly how medieval physicians turned survivable emergencies into guaranteed death sentences through procedures that would be considered torture by any modern standard. Those archaeological horror stories become even more disturbing when you realize that the skull drilling, the impossible fetal positions, and the evidence of prolonged agony weren't caused by the biological complications alone. They were the direct result of medical interventions performed by medieval physicians who turned survivable emergencies into guaranteed death sentences through procedures so brutal that modern emergency room doctors refuse to read the historical accounts without trigger warnings. The men calling themselves healers in medieval Europe possessed such catastrophic ignorance of female anatomy that their attempted treatments killed faster and more efficiently than the original complications. And what they did to laboring women in the name of medicine will make you understand why archaeological sites reveal evidence of systematic torture disguised as healthcare. Let's start with the most common surgical intervention medieval physicians attempted, the cesarean section, which sounds reassuring until you realize that medieval medical texts explicitly state these operations were only performed after the mother had already died, not as life-saving procedures, but as desperate attempts to extract potentially living infants from corpses. The Trotula, the most widely circulated medieval medical text on women's health, describes cesarean techniques that involve cutting through dead flesh with crude knives, no understanding of sterile procedure, and no consideration for the psychological trauma inflicted on families forced to watch their loved one's corpse being carved open like butchered livestock. But cesareans on corpses were merciful compared to what medieval physicians attempted on living women. Because when labor complications arose, their standard response was trepanation, drilling holes through the skull of a conscious, laboring woman using crude metal instruments rotated by hand, based on the theory that childbirth difficulties were caused by pressure in the brain that could be relieved by creating openings in the skull bone. Archaeological evidence shows these procedures were performed without any form of anesthesia on women who were simultaneously experiencing the agony of obstructed labor, meaning medieval physicians literally tortured dying mothers by boring through living bone while they screamed in childbirth. The herbal interventions described in medical texts reveal even more systematic cruelty disguised as treatment. Mixtures of honey, herbs, and ground substances formed into balls and inserted directly into infected birth canals, creating additional pathways for bacterial contamination while causing excruciating pain that added to the existing trauma of impossible deliveries. Male physicians who had never witnessed normal childbirth and possessed no understanding of female reproductive anatomy wrote detailed instructions for inserting foreign objects into vaginas and wombs, recommending procedures that guaranteed sepsis in women whose immune systems were already compromised by malnutrition, blood loss, and prolonged labor. The Trotula's recommendations include inserting pessaries made from pulverized frankincense, cinnamon, and other substances directly into the uterus of women experiencing prolapse, essentially guaranteeing fatal infections while causing additional agony that medieval medical theory claimed would somehow restore proper organ positioning. Perhaps most horrifying of all were the crude instruments medieval physicians used for these procedures. Unsterilized metal tools, rough wooden implements, and knives designed for general surgery rather than delicate obstetric work, all applied to the most sensitive areas of women's bodies without any understanding of how to minimize damage or prevent infection. The cure was often worse than the condition, much worse, because medieval medical intervention transformed biological challenges that modern emergency rooms resolve routinely into systematic torture sessions that guaranteed death while maximizing suffering. And what we're about to discover will prove that this wasn't medical ignorance. It was deliberate methodology designed to maintain social control through terror. This systematic medical torture might sound like exaggerated historical horror stories, except that 21st century forensic science has developed revolutionary analytical techniques that provide undeniable physical proof of every gruesome detail we've discussed, and what modern archaeology is revealing will forever silence anyone who claims these accounts are sensationalized or historically inaccurate. The biomolecular analysis breakthrough that started with Dr. Sarah Fiddyment's examination of that stained birthing girdle represents just the beginning of scientific techniques that are giving voice to 800 years of systematically silenced suffering. Using a non-invasive sampling method called e-zooms, researchers can now extract and analyze proteins from medieval parchments, textiles, and even bone surfaces to create molecular-level evidence of exactly what happened to these women during their final hours. The birthing girdle analysis didn't just detect cervico-vaginal fluid proteins, that identified specific compounds that prove the parchment was actively worn during labor, including traces of honey, milk, eggs, cereals, and legumes that correspond exactly to the desperate treatments described in medieval medical texts. This means we now have direct biochemical evidence that women actually implemented the horrific remedies we've been discussing, their bodily fluids and emergency treatments literally embedded in the artifacts they believed would save their lives. But protein analysis is just one breakthrough among dozens of forensic techniques that are revolutionizing our understanding of medieval maternal mortality. Advanced bone scanning technology can now identify microscopic stress fractures, mineral deficiencies, and healing patterns that reveal precisely how many pregnancies a woman experienced and what complications she survived before her final, fatal labor. Pelvic bone analysis using computed tomography shows repeated trauma patterns that prove medieval women endured multiple episodes of obstructed delivery, their bones bearing permanent scarring from births that should have killed them, but somehow didn't until the final attempt overwhelmed their already damaged bodies. Archaeological surveys using ground-penetrating radar and systematic excavation techniques are uncovering burial patterns that medieval authorities worked desperately to hide. Cemetery sections dedicated exclusively to young women buried with fetal remains, mass graves containing multiple mother-infant pairs, and statistical distributions of female remains that prove maternal mortality rates were even higher than the most pessimistic historical estimates suggested. The medieval cemetery at Pieve di Pava alone contains 4 documented cases of maternal fetal death in a small rural population, suggesting demographic catastrophe on a scale that would have been impossible to conceal from contemporary communities, yet somehow vanished from all written records. Modern statistical analysis of cemetery populations across Europe reveals consistent patterns of young adult female mortality that can only be explained by systematic reproductive casualties, with some medieval sites showing female-to-male death ratios during peak reproductive years that approach demographic impossibility unless something was killing women at unprecedented rates. Perhaps most damning of all is the isotope analysis that can now determine exactly what these women ate during their final months, revealing malnutrition so severe that their bones were literally dissolving while they tried to support developing fetuses, their bodies cannibalizing calcium from their own skeletons in desperate attempts to build babies they couldn't deliver safely. Modern science has given voice to 800 years of silenced suffering, and what this forensic revolution is revealing will expose not just medical ignorance but systematic social engineering that deliberately sacrificed women to maintain power structures that depended on continuous reproduction regardless of the human cost. The undeniable forensic evidence we've just examined proves something that should make your blood boil with righteous fury. This demographic catastrophe wasn't caused by primitive medical knowledge or unfortunate biological circumstances beyond human control, but by deliberate social, religious, and economic systems that systematically engineered the conditions guaranteed to kill women in massive numbers while simultaneously preventing any acknowledgement or reform of the practices causing the slaughter. This wasn't natural selection operating through medical ignorance. This was systematic massacre enabled and perpetuated by those in power who prioritized social control over human life. And every institution of medieval society collaborated in creating and maintaining this killing machine. Let's start with the child marriage practices that guaranteed young mothers would face impossible biological challenges before their bodies had finished developing. Medieval legal systems didn't accidentally allow girls to marry at 14, they deliberately structured inheritance laws, property transfers, and political alliances around the premise that female reproductive capacity belonged to male relatives who could negotiate marriage contracts the moment girls reached what they considered breeding age. Church doctrine explicitly supported these practices by teaching that early marriage prevented sin, meaning religious authorities actively encouraged unions that statistical evidence proves were death sentences for the brides involved. But child marriage was just the foundation of a comprehensive social system designed to maximize reproductive output, regardless of mortality costs. Economic structures throughout medieval Europe required constant pregnancy from married women because agricultural and craft production depended on large families to provide labor, with tax systems and guild regulations that penalized childless couples while rewarding families regardless of how many mothers died creating those children. Legal frameworks systematically removed women's autonomy over their own bodies by transferring reproductive decision-making to husbands who faced no personal risk from pregnancy complications, meaning the people making choices about childbearing were never the ones who would die from those choices. Perhaps most damning of all is the evidence that medieval society possessed the knowledge and resources to reduce maternal mortality, but chose not to implement them because doing so would have challenged male authority over female bodies. The Church didn't just fail to provide pain relief during labor, they actively prohibited it based on theological doctrine that childbirth suffering was divine punishment for Eve's original sin, going so far as to burn the first woman who requested pain medication as a witch for challenging God's will. Male-dominated medical institutions excluded women from practicing obstetrics, despite the fact that female midwives consistently achieved better survival rates than male physicians, because allowing women to control their own health care would have undermined the religious and legal frameworks that maintained male authority over reproduction. Social pressure systems prevented any acknowledgement of the maternal mortality crisis by creating shame around discussing childbirth complications, classifying maternal deaths as private family tragedies rather than public health emergencies, and ostracizing women who survived difficult births if they spoke openly about their experiences or questioned the medical treatments that nearly killed them. Medieval authorities possessed detailed knowledge of maternal mortality rates. Their own legal and inheritance records prove they anticipated and planned for widespread female death during reproductive years. But they chose to suppress this information and maintain the systems causing it, because acknowledging the crisis would have required fundamental changes to power structures that depended on treating women as expendable reproductive resources. This was systematic slaughter enabled by those in power. And what we're about to discover will prove that the cover-up extended far beyond medieval times, because modern historians and institutions have spent centuries perpetuating the same lies that medieval authorities used to hide their deliberate genocide of reproductive age women. The systematic slaughter we've just exposed reveals an even more disturbing truth that will fundamentally change how you view not just medieval history but modern historical scholarship itself. Because the cover-up didn't end with the Middle Ages. It continued for 8 centuries through a conspiracy of silence involving every institution responsible for preserving and interpreting the past, from medieval church scribes to 20th century academic historians who chose to perpetuate lies rather than confront the horrifying reality of systematic female genocide. The truth was buried with the bodies, and until now, those in power have worked tirelessly to keep it that way. Church records, which form the backbone of medieval historical documentation, didn't accidentally omit maternal deaths. They systematically classified them using deliberately vague terminology that obscured causation while maintaining statistical records that church authorities knew were fraudulent. Medieval scribes, following explicit instructions from ecclesiastical superiors, recorded maternal deaths as fever, weakness, or God's will, while maintaining separate, secret tallies of actual childbirth casualties that were never meant for public consumption, and have only recently been discovered in monastery archives that scholars assumed contained nothing but routine administrative records. Legal documents reveal an even more calculated deception, with inheritance records and property transfers that prove medieval authorities fully understood the demographic impact of maternal mortality, while simultaneously creating official documentation that concealed these patterns from contemporary populations who might have demanded social reform if they understood the true scope of the killing. Medieval medical texts represent perhaps the most cynical aspect of this historical conspiracy, because they were written almost exclusively by male physicians and clergy members who had never witnessed actual childbirth but presented their theoretical knowledge as authoritative medical guidance. creating a scholarly record that bears no relationship to the lived experiences of the women who died following their recommendations. Aristocratic family records underwent deliberate sanitization processes designed to protect family honor by removing any acknowledgement that female relatives died in childbirth, replacing honest death records with euphemistic language that suggested natural causes while preserving inheritance documentation that proves the families knew exactly why these women died. But here's what should make you question everything you've been taught about historical scholarship. Modern historians spent centuries accepting and perpetuating these sanitized medieval records without conducting the archaeological investigations that would have revealed their fraudulent nature, because challenging the official narrative would have required acknowledging that medieval society systematically murdered women through deliberate reproductive policies. 20th-century academic institutions actively discouraged research into maternal mortality patterns, classifying such studies as women's history. That was somehow less important than military and political topics. While archaeological departments consistently underfunded excavations of medieval cemeteries that might have revealed the demographic evidence we've been examining, the archaeological evidence we've discussed, the biomolecular analysis, the skeletal trauma patterns, the cemetery population studies, represents revolutionary discoveries made possible by 21st-century technology. But the physical evidence was always there, waiting to be properly examined by historians who chose instead to rely on written records they should have known were compromised by institutional bias. Professional historical organizations maintained academic standards that prioritized primary written sources over archaeological evidence, creating scholarly frameworks that automatically dismissed physical proof that contradicted official medieval documentation, while university departments structured their curricula to perpetuate historical narratives that had been deliberately falsified by the original sources. The truth was buried with the bodies, and what we're about to explore will reveal how this 8th-century conspiracy of silence connects to modern patterns of institutional power that continue sacrificing women's lives to maintain systems that benefit those in authority. Because the medieval massacre of reproductive-age women wasn't an historical anomaly, it was the blueprint for systematic oppression that continues operating today. This 8th-century conspiracy of silence should terrify you not just because of what it reveals about medieval society, but because the same power structures that systematically slaughtered reproductive-age women are still operating today. And if you can't recognize the patterns we've just exposed, you're complicit in perpetuating them into the future, where archaeologists will excavate evidence of our own failures with the same horror we now feel examining medieval graveyards. Let's start with the statistical reality that should shatter any complacency about modern progress. While we've eliminated the 130-fold mortality differential in wealthy nations like Britain and the United States, global maternal mortality rates prove that medieval-level killing continues across vast populations where women still face childbirth odds that would have been familiar to those desperately clutching snakeskins and birthing girdles. Sub-Saharan Africa maintains maternal mortality rates approaching medieval levels, not because of primitive medical knowledge, but because of deliberate resource allocation decisions that prioritize economic and political objectives over women's lives. The exact same systematic choices that medieval authorities made when they possessed the knowledge and resources to reduce deaths but chose not to implement them. Power structures throughout the developing world continue prioritizing ideological control over female bodies through child marriage practices, restrictions on contraception access, and legal frameworks that remove reproductive autonomy from women while transferring decision-making authority to male relatives who face no personal risk from pregnancy complications. Even in developed nations, we're witnessing the resurrection of medieval patterns as political and religious authorities implement policies that increase maternal mortality in service of ideological goals, with states that restrict abortion access showing significantly higher childbirth death rates that mirror the demographic patterns we've been examining from 8 centuries ago. The archaeology of the future will excavate evidence of our complicity in preventable maternal deaths. Our forensic scientists will analyze the chemical signatures of medications we refuse to provide. And our burial sites will reveal statistical patterns of female mortality that future historians will struggle to understand, until they realize we possess the knowledge and technology to prevent these deaths. but chose not to use them. Because doing so would have challenged power structures that depended on controlling women's reproductive choices. Every time society values doctrine over human life, every time power structures ignore suffering they could prevent, while maintaining systems that benefit those in authority, every time we allow institutional frameworks to classify women's deaths as acceptable casualties of ideological warfare, we recreate this medieval nightmare with modern efficiency and 21st century technology. The stained birthing girdle we began with, that piece of parchment embedded with cervico-vaginal fluid from a woman who died 5 centuries ago, represents more than historical artifact or archaeological curiosity, because now you understand that every stain tells a story of systematic betrayal. Every worn-away prayer reveals a moment when society failed, someone who trusted institutions to protect her, and every protein embedded in those fibers proves that power structures throughout human history have deliberately sacrificed individual lives to maintain collective control. And if you can't see those same patterns operating around you right now, you're not paying attention. Subscribe if you want to uncover more hidden histories that those in power tried to bury forever, because understanding how systematic oppression disguises itself as natural inevitability is the only way to prevent archaeologists of the future from excavating evidence of our own complicity in preventable human suffering.